Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and 18 months ago, I never would have believed that silence could have a texture. I was a glaciologist, still am technically, though I haven't returned to field work since the incident at Station Polaris. My specialty was ice core analysis, the patient work of reading Earth's climate history through frozen layers that stretch back millennia. It was good work, important work, and it paid well enough that I could ignore the isolation that came with Arctic research postings. I'd always been comfortable with solitude, with the vast white emptiness of the far north, with the kind of quiet that most people find unsettling. That comfort, I've come to understand, was a form of ignorance. True isolation, the kind that exists in certain places that have been touched by something beyond our understanding of the natural world, that's different. That changes you in ways that don't heal. The job posting appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning in March, forwarded by my department chair with a brief note. Thought you might be interested. Good money, and God knows you could use a win after the funding cuts. He wasn't wrong. The university had slashed our research budget by 40%, and I'd been scrambling to find ways to keep my graduate students employed and my projects viable. The position was for a 3-month contract analyzing ice cores at a private research facility in northern Alaska, conducting what the posting described as specialized atmospheric composition studies. The salary was more than twice what I made in a year of university work. The contract included full room and board, equipment provision, and a completion bonus that would have cleared the remainder of my student loans. I should have wondered why they were offering so much money. I should have asked more questions about why a private facility needed a glaciologist for 3 months of isolated work, or why the posting had been sent directly to department chairs rather than advertised through normal channels. I should have researched Helios Northern Research Corporation more thoroughly than a cursory Google search that revealed nothing but a sparse website and a handful of vague references in scientific journals. But the funding cuts had left me desperate, and desperation makes people overlook red flags that should have been blindingly obvious. The interview was conducted via video call by a Dr. Marcus Webb, who introduced himself as the facility director. He appeared to be in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of deeply weathered face that comes from years of field work in harsh climates. Behind him, I could see what looked like a standard office: filing cabinets, framed degrees, a window showing nothing but white expanse. He asked competent questions about my experience with ice core analysis, about my comfort level with isolation, about my health and physical fitness. Standard stuff for Arctic research work. The only moment that gave me pause was near the end of the interview, when he asked if I had family who would be concerned about losing contact for extended periods. The communication systems at Station Polaris can be unreliable, he explained, his tone matter of fact. We have satellite uplink for data transmission and emergencies, but personal communications are limited to weekly email checks. Some of our researchers find this difficult. I told him it wouldn't be a problem. I'd been divorced for 3 years, my parents were dead, and my few close friends were accustomed to my long silences during field seasons. The isolation, I assured him, was part of the appeal. He seemed satisfied with this answer, and 48 hours later, I received a contract and travel arrangements. The journey to Station Polaris took 3 days. I flew from Seattle to Anchorage, then caught a smaller plane to Utqiagvik, the northernmost community in Alaska. From there, I was picked up by a bush pilot named Thomas Greaves, a taciturn man in his 40s who flew a twin otter that had seen better decades. The flight northeast took 4 hours, passing over terrain that grew progressively more desolate, the boreal forest giving way to tundra, then to a landscape of ice and rock that seemed to exist at the edge of the world. Greaves spoke perhaps 20 words during the entire flight, responding to my attempts at conversation with grunts and monosyllables. When I finally stopped trying to engage him, he seemed relieved. Station Polaris appeared on the horizon as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ice. The facility was larger than I'd expected, a cluster of interconnected modular buildings arranged in a rough hexagon around a central courtyard. The structures were painted a faded blue-gray that blended with the ice and sky, making the station seem almost like a natural formation, something that had grown from the frozen ground rather than been built upon it. Solar panels and satellite dishes bristled from the roofs. A radio tower rose from the central building, reaching perhaps 60 feet into the air, its red warning light blinking steadily against the pale sky. Greaves brought the plane down on a packed snow runway with the casual skill of someone who'd made this landing hundreds of times. As the engines wound down, he finally spoke a full sentence. 3 months, you said. That's right, I confirmed, gathering my gear. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not quite concern, not quite pity, but something adjacent to both. Good luck, he said, and the way he said it made it sound less like a pleasantry and more like a warning. Dr. Webb met me at the airstrip, accompanied by a younger man he introduced as James Keller, the station's logistics coordinator. Webb looked older in person, his face more deeply lined, his movements slower than they'd seemed on video. But his handshake was firm, and his welcome seemed genuine enough. Keller was perhaps 30, with the kind of lean, efficient build that comes from regular physical labor. He loaded my equipment onto a small ATV trailer without being asked, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd performed this task many times before. How was the flight? Webb asked as we walked toward the main building, our boots crunching on the packed snow. Long, I said, but fine. Your pilot isn't much for conversation. Thomas? No, he's not, but he's reliable, and reliability is what matters out here. You'll find that Station Polaris attracts a certain type, people who value competence over congeniality. He paused at the entrance, a heavy steel door with a wheel lock that looked like it belonged on a submarine. Before we go in, I should mention that we have some unusual protocols here. Nothing concerning, just adaptations to the environment and the nature of our work. James will brief you on everything during your orientation tomorrow. The interior of the station was warmer than I'd expected, almost uncomfortably so after the bite of the outside air. The entrance opened into a large common area that served as dining hall, lounge, and general gathering space. The furnishings were utilitarian but comfortable, tables and chairs that had clearly seen years of use, a few worn sofas arranged around a television, bookshelves lined with an eclectic mix of scientific texts and paperback novels. The walls were painted a neutral beige, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their brightness harsh after the perpetual twilight outside. 3 other people were in the common area when we entered. Webb introduced them efficiently. Dr. Patricia Voss, a meteorologist in her early 40s with graying blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Mikhail Fedorov, a Russian atmospheric physicist whose precise English carried only the faintest accent, and Dr. Lisa Torres, a geologist who looked to be in her late 20s and greeted me with a warm smile that seemed almost out of place in the stark surroundings. Sarah will be handling ice core analysis for Project Memoria, Webb announced to the group. She'll be in Lab 3, standard schedule. Patricia, I trust you can help orient her to our meal times and general procedures. Patricia nodded, her expression neutral. Of course. Sarah, we eat breakfast at 0700, lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800. Attendance isn't mandatory, but the kitchen closes between service times, so if you miss a meal, you're on your own until the next one. Coffee's always available in the urn by the door, and there's a snack cabinet, but stock is limited, so be considerate. Project Memoria, I asked, looking at Webb. That wasn't in the briefing materials. No, he agreed. The project details are classified under our corporate confidentiality agreements. You'll receive a full briefing tomorrow morning after you've had a chance to rest and settle in. For now, I'll show you to your quarters. My room was on the second floor of the northern wing, accessible through a corridor that seemed longer than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed. The door was solid steel, like all the others I'd seen, with a numeric keypad lock and a small window reinforced with wire mesh. Inside, the space was Spartan but adequate. A twin bed with white linens, a desk and chair, a small dresser, and a private bathroom that consisted of a toilet, sink, and narrow shower stall. A single window looked out over the ice, though heavy blackout curtains were drawn across it. The walls were the same neutral beige as the common areas, broken only by a digital clock and a small speaker grill that I assumed was part of an intercom system. Locks are programmed to your personnel code, Webb explained, handing me a laminated card with a 6-digit number. Memorize it and destroy the card. The code will also access Lab 3 and the areas you'll need for your work. Any questions? I had dozens, but I was exhausted from the journey, and I knew that pushing for answers now would likely get me nowhere. Where's Lab 3? Basement level, East Corridor. James will take you there tomorrow after breakfast and your briefing. He paused in the doorway. One more thing. You'll notice that we maintain fairly strict schedules here. Meals at set times, work hours that are clearly defined, regular sleep patterns. This isn't arbitrary. The human body doesn't cope well with the Arctic winter if you let your routines slip. The constant darkness can play tricks on your circadian rhythms, make it easy to lose track of time. So we impose structure. I recommend you adhere to it. After he left, I unpacked my belongings and tried to settle in, but the strangeness of the place kept me restless. The silence was the first thing I noticed, a quality of quiet that went beyond mere absence of sound. In other research stations I'd worked at, there was always ambient noise. The hum of generators, the whisper of ventilation systems, the occasional creak of building materials expanding and contracting in the temperature fluctuations. Here, there was nothing. Even the fluorescent lights, which I could see were illuminated, made no sound. I stood in the center of my room and held my breath, listening, and the silence was so complete that I could hear my pulse in my ears, a rhythm that seemed too loud, too insistent. I opened the blackout curtains to look outside, seeking some visual stimulus to break the oppressive quiet. The view through the window showed the central courtyard and beyond it, the endless expanse of ice and sky. The sun had fully set by now, but it wasn't the total darkness I'd expected. Instead, the world was suffused with a strange twilight, the kind of ambient illumination that seems to come from the air itself rather than any specific source. The ice gleamed dully, and the stars overhead were brighter than I'd ever seen them, hard white points against the black sky that seemed close enough to touch. As I watched, a figure emerged from one of the buildings across the courtyard, too distant and indistinct to identify, bundled in heavy cold weather gear that made their gender and build impossible to determine. They stood motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, facing not toward any of the other buildings but out toward the ice, their posture suggesting intense concentration or perhaps listening. Then they turned and walked back inside with quick, precise movements, and I was alone with the view again. I let the curtain fall closed and turned back to my room, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. The nearest settlement was Utqiagvik, more than 300 miles away. The nearest hospital significantly farther. If something went wrong here, help would be hours away at best, and that was assuming the weather allowed for a rescue flight. The contract I'd signed included an acknowledgement that emergency evacuation couldn't be guaranteed, that I accepted the inherent risks of working in such a remote location. At the time, sitting in my comfortable office in Seattle, those had seemed like standard liability clauses. Now, standing in this quiet room at the edge of the world, they took on a different weight. I forced myself to follow my normal field work routine, check my equipment, organize my work clothes, review my notes on the project goals. Except I didn't actually have any notes on the project goals, I realized. The briefing materials I'd received had been surprisingly vague about the actual research objectives. Atmospheric composition studies could mean almost anything. Ice cores contained bubbles of ancient air, preserving samples of Earth's atmosphere from thousands of years ago. Analyzing them could reveal information about historical climate patterns, greenhouse gas concentrations, volcanic activity, solar radiation levels. The list was extensive. But which specific aspects was I supposed to be examining? What were the hypotheses driving this research? I pulled up the contract on my laptop, reading through it more carefully than I had when I'd first signed it. The language was dense with legal terminology, but certain phrases stood out now that I was actually here. Novel atmospheric phenomena, data of a potentially sensitive nature, strict confidentiality regarding all observations. There was a whole section on information security that I'd glossed over before, including provisions that prohibited discussing my work with anyone outside the facility, that required all notes and data to remain on site, that gave Helios Northern Research Corporation ownership of any discoveries or observations I made during my contract period. Standard enough for corporate research, I told myself. Companies protect their proprietary information. That's normal. That's expected. But something about the language nagged at me, a sense that these clauses were more restrictive than what I'd encountered in previous private sector work. The section on data ownership, in particular, had a strange provision. Any observations deemed potentially destabilizing to established scientific frameworks would be classified and subject to additional review before any publication or disclosure could be considered. What kind of atmospheric data could be destabilizing to established scientific frameworks? I closed the laptop and lay down on the narrow bed, telling myself I was overthinking things, that I was tired from travel and disoriented by the strangeness of the environment. The research would make sense tomorrow after the briefing. Dr. Webb seemed professional enough, and the other researchers I'd met had appeared normal, focused and perhaps a bit worn by the isolation, but not concerning. This was just another field season, just another contract job, 3 months of work, a substantial paycheck, and then back to my normal life. I turned off the lights and tried to sleep, but the silence kept pulling me back to wakefulness. In the darkness, it seemed to have weight to press against my eardrums like changes in air pressure. I found myself straining to hear something, anything. Footsteps in the corridor, voices from other rooms, the mechanical sounds of the building's systems. But there was nothing, just that profound quiet that seemed to absorb sound rather than merely existing in its absence. At some point, I must have finally slept because I woke to the harsh beeping of my alarm clock showing 0630. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was, and the disorientation was complete. The unfamiliar room, the quality of light filtering around the edges of the curtains, the continued silence that seemed wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Then memory reasserted itself. Station Polaris, Alaska, a 3-month contract. First full day. I showered and dressed in layers, thermal base layer, fleece mid-layer, work pants with reinforced knees. The bathroom mirror showed me looking drawn, older than my 36 years, with dark circles under my eyes that spoke to the poor sleep I'd managed. I splashed cold water on my face and told myself to get it together. This was what I'd signed up for, what I'd needed. Focus on the work, collect the paycheck, ignore the strangeness. The common area was more populated when I arrived at 0655, with perhaps a dozen people gathered around the dining tables. I recognized Patricia, Mikko, and Lisa from the previous evening, along with several others I hadn't met yet. The atmosphere was subdued, people eating in near silence, speaking in low voices when they communicated at all. A serving window connected to what I assumed was the kitchen area, and I followed the example of others by taking a tray and plate from a stack near the door. The food was institutional but adequate. Scrambled eggs that had been made from powder, bacon that was crisp enough to suggest it had been frozen, toast with margarine and jam, fruit from cans. I filled my plate and took a seat at one of the tables, next to Lisa Torres, who nodded a greeting around a mouthful of eggs. "Sleep okay?" she asked after swallowing. "Well enough," I lied, still adjusting to the environment. "It takes a few days. The quiet gets to everyone at first. Your brain keeps expecting ambient noise that isn't there. Eventually, you adapt." She paused as if considering whether to say more. "Or at least most people do." "Most people." She shrugged, a gesture that seemed deliberately casual. "Some people find they can't handle the isolation, even with experience. We've had a few researchers leave before their contracts were up. Dr. Webb screens pretty carefully now, but occasionally someone still washes out." I wanted to ask more, but Dr. Webb himself entered the common area at precisely 0700, and the low conversations that had been taking place ceased entirely. He moved to the center of the room, not raising his voice but somehow commanding complete attention. "Good morning. For those who haven't met her yet, this is Dr. Sarah Chen, our new ice core specialist. She'll be working on Project Memoria for the next 3 months. Sarah, I'll meet you in conference room A at 0800 for your full briefing. Everyone else, standard schedules today. Patricia, I'll need your latest atmospheric readings by 1000. Mikhail, have you finished calibrating the new spectrometer?" The Russian nodded. "Completed last night. It's ready for use, though I'm still seeing some anomalies in the baseline readings." "What kind of anomalies?" "Fluctuations in the nitrogen isotope ratios. Small but consistent, outside normal variation ranges." Webb's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle tension entering his shoulders. We'll discuss it after Sarah's briefing. Make sure you have the data compiled and ready to present. Breakfast concluded at 07:30, and people dispersed to various parts of the station, moving with the purposeful efficiency of established routines. I returned to my room to brush my teeth and gather a notebook and pen, then made my way back downstairs to find conference room A. The room was small and windowless, with a table that could seat perhaps 6 people, a wall-mounted screen, and the same neutral beige walls that seemed to be standard throughout the facility. Dr. Webb was already there, along with James Keller, and a woman I hadn't met yet, perhaps in her 60s, with steel-gray hair cut short and sharp blue eyes that assessed me with uncomfortable intensity. "Dr. Chen," Webb said. "This is Dr. Evelyn Park, our chief atmospheric scientist. She'll be your primary point of contact for Project Memoria, along with James for any logistical needs." Dr. Park's handshake was firm to the point of being aggressive. "Welcome to Station Polaris, Dr. Chen. I've reviewed your credentials. Impressive work on the Greenland cores. Your analysis of the Younger Dryas transition period was particularly noteworthy." "Thank you," I said, taking a seat at the table. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about what kind of atmospheric research requires a 3-month analysis contract at this facility. The briefing materials were somewhat vague on specifics." "Intentionally so," Webb said. "What I'm about to tell you is covered under the confidentiality agreement you signed. Breaking this agreement would result not only in termination of your contract and forfeiture of all compensation, but potentially criminal charges under federal information security statutes. Do you understand?" I felt a flutter of unease in my stomach, but I nodded. "I understand." Webb tapped a control on the table, and the wall screen illuminated, showing what appeared to be a satellite image of the Arctic region. Station Polaris was established 7 years ago, officially as a climate research facility studying polar atmospheric conditions. That's true, as far as it goes. But the primary purpose of this station is to investigate a phenomenon we've designated anomaly null 7. The image on the screen shifted, zooming in on what looked like empty Arctic landscape, then overlaying it with data, colored contours and numerical values that meant nothing to me yet. 4 years ago, our satellite monitoring detected unusual atmospheric readings in this region. Specifically, isotope ratios in the air column showed values that don't match any known natural or anthropogenic processes. The nitrogen isotope signature suggests these air samples are significantly older than should be possible, not thousands of years old, like we'd expect from ice core bubbles, but millions of years old. Air from an Earth that existed before humans, before most mammals, before the climate patterns we consider normal. I stared at the screen, trying to process what he was saying. That's impossible. Air mixes constantly. There's no mechanism for preserving atmospheric samples of that age outside of ice cores. Correct, Dr. Park said. Which is why we initially assumed equipment malfunction or contamination. We ran every calibration protocol, replaced every component, brought in new instruments from multiple manufacturers. The readings persisted, so we established this station to investigate the source directly. "And what did you find?" Webb and Park exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret. Finally, Park spoke. "We found that the anomalous readings are real, and they're localized to a specific area approximately 40 kilometers northwest of this facility. The air within that zone contains atmospheric signatures from multiple geological epochs, sometimes changing within meters of elevation or horizontal distance. It's as if the normal mixing processes that homogenize Earth's atmosphere simply don't apply there. That violates basic fluid dynamics, I said. Air masses mix through convection, advection, molecular diffusion. You can't have isolated pockets of ancient atmosphere just sitting there in the modern world. Yes, Webb agreed. That's precisely the problem. What exists out there shouldn't exist, yet it does. And our attempts to understand it have raised more questions than they've answered. James Keller, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. 3 years ago, we sent a research team to the anomaly site itself to collect direct samples and take measurements. They spent 48 hours there in a temporary camp, gathering data. When they returned, the readings from their equipment were, he paused, seeming to search for words, inconsistent. Some instruments showed one set of values, others showed completely different readings, even though they were supposedly measuring the same air samples from the same locations at the same times. Instrument interference, I suggested. Electromagnetic anomalies can corrupt electronic readings. That was our initial hypothesis, Park said, but the discrepancies were too specific, too patterned. And then there were the other observations. What other observations? Another exchange of looks. Then Webb pulled up a new image on the screen, a photograph taken outdoors in the Arctic twilight. It showed a figure in cold weather gear standing beside what looked like a sampling station, various instruments and equipment cases arranged on the snow. The figure was looking directly at the camera, their face clearly visible through the face shield of their parka hood. The expression was neutral, almost blank, but something about the eyes seemed wrong, too wide, too fixed, the kind of stare that goes on a few seconds too long to be comfortable. This is Dr. Raymond Costa, Webb said. He was the team leader for that expedition. This photo was taken on their second day at the site, approximately 6 hours before they packed up and returned to Station Polaris. He advanced to the next image. It was the same man, same location, same equipment array. But the figure in the photo was different, or rather, it was the same but multiplied. 3 identical Dr. Raymond Costas stood in the frame, positioned at slightly different distances from the camera, all with that same fixed stare, all frozen in the exact same posture. This was taken 30 seconds later, Webb said quietly. Same camera, continuous shooting mode. No possibility of deliberate manipulation or multiple exposure. I felt my mouth go dry. There has to be an explanation. Camera malfunction, optical effect, something. We thought so too. We examined the camera extensively, had the images analyzed by digital forensics experts. The photos are genuine, unaltered. Whatever the camera recorded, it was actually there. Park's voice was clinical, matter of fact, as if she were discussing a routine experimental result. And it wasn't an isolated incident. The team took hundreds of photos during their time at the site. Approximately 15% of them show similar anomalies, duplicated people, equipment that appears in locations where it shouldn't be, shadows that don't match the position of objects, that sort of thing. Did the team members notice these anomalies at the time? I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. No, Webb said. That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Dr. Costa and his colleagues reported that their expedition was uneventful. They collected their samples, performed their measurements, and returned according to schedule. When we showed them the photographs, they had no memory of anything unusual occurring. As far as they were concerned, nothing out of the ordinary had happened. I sat back in my chair, trying to integrate this information into a coherent framework and failing. So you're telling me there's a location 40 kilometers from here, where the laws of physics apparently don't apply, where air from millions of years ago somehow exists alongside modern atmosphere, where cameras record images of impossible things that the people present don't perceive. And you want me to analyze ice cores from this location. The cores were extracted by drilling rig last summer, Park explained. Remote operation, no direct human presence at the anomaly site. We have approximately 300 meters of continuous core samples, representing roughly the last 12,000 years of atmospheric deposition. What we need from you is a detailed analysis of the atmospheric composition at various depths, with particular attention to any anomalies in isotope ratios, trace gas concentrations, or particulate content. You're looking for evidence of when this started, I said slowly, when the atmospheric anomalies began appearing in the ice record. Among other things, Webb said, we're also interested in whether the anomalies show any pattern of intensification or change over time, whether there are correlations with known climatic events or human activities, and whether there's any indication of what might be causing this phenomenon. And if I find something that suggests the anomaly is natural, ancient, something that's been there longer than human civilization, then we'll have our answer, Park said, one way or another. The briefing continued for another 2 hours, covering the technical specifications of the ice cores, the analysis protocols I should follow, the equipment available in Lab 3, and the schedule for reporting my findings. Through it all, I kept thinking about that photograph. 3 versions of the same man, all with those 2 wide eyes, all staring at a camera held by someone who apparently saw nothing unusual. What kind of place could do that? What kind of force could bend reality in such specific, targeted ways? When the briefing finally concluded, James Keller led me down to Lab 3. The basement level was accessed through a stairwell that seemed to descend farther than the building's height should have allowed, the steps extending down into dimness even though fluorescent lights were visible at regular intervals. The temperature dropped noticeably as we descended, and by the time we reached the bottom, I could see my breath misting in the air. We keep the basement cold, James explained. Helps preserve the ice cores, reduces energy costs. You'll want to wear your full cold weather gear when working down here. There are parkas and gloves in the lab. Lab 3 was a long, narrow room lined with what looked like chest freezers, but were actually specialized cold storage units for the ice cores. A central workbench held a core processing station, a temperature-controlled environment where I could work with the ice without it melting, surrounded by analytical instruments for measuring various properties. Gas chromatographs, mass spectrometers, optical analysis equipment, everything I'd need for a comprehensive ice core study, and all of it top of the line, newer and more sophisticated than anything I'd worked with at the university. The cores are cataloged by depth and date, James said, pulling up a digital manifest on a monitor mounted to the wall. We have continuous coverage from surface to 300 meters, which takes us back approximately 12,000 years based on our ice accumulation models. Dr. Park wants you to start with cores from the most recent 2,000 years, then work backward through the record. Priority is on identifying any sudden changes or anomalies in the atmospheric composition, particularly in isotope ratios. He showed me how to retrieve cores from the storage units, how to log them out and back in, how to use the processing station's various functions. It was all standard procedure, familiar from dozens of previous ice core analyses I'd conducted, except for the purpose, except for what I might find. "One more thing," James said as he was preparing to leave. "If you notice anything unusual while working down here, and I mean anything, not just in the ice cores but in the environment itself, report it immediately to Dr. Webb or Dr. Park. Don't try to investigate it yourself. Don't try to explain it away. Just report it. That's critical. Do you understand?" "What kind of unusual things should I be watching for?" He was silent for a long moment, his expression difficult to read. Temperature fluctuations that don't match the HVAC settings, sounds that don't have an obvious source, the sense that the dimensions of the room have changed, visual artifacts, things that seem to be there when you look directly at them but disappear in your peripheral vision. Anything that makes you feel disoriented or uncertain about your surroundings. Has that happened before, to other researchers working down here? "Sometimes," he admitted. "The basement level seems to be more susceptible to, we're not sure what to call it, spillover maybe from the anomaly site. It's rare and it's never been dangerous, but we track it carefully. Hence the reporting protocol." After he left, I stood in the cold silence of Lab 3 and tried to assess how I felt about all of this. The rational part of my mind insisted that there had to be reasonable explanations for everything I'd been told, that the atmospheric anomalies were the result of some unknown but natural process, that the photographs had been misinterpreted or corrupted in ways the forensic analysis hadn't detected, that the strangeness of this place was just the product of isolation and the psychological effects of the Arctic environment. But another part of me, a part I didn't particularly want to acknowledge, recognized that I'd already accepted the reality of what I'd been told. The ice cores in those storage units contained evidence of something that shouldn't exist, and I was going to analyze them, and I was going to find proof that the world was stranger than I'd been taught to believe. I pulled on one of the heavy parkas from the rack near the door, insulated gloves that made my hands clumsy, and began familiarizing myself with the equipment. The mass spectrometer was a thermoscientific model I'd used before, configured for isotope ratio analysis with the precision necessary to detect the kind of anomalies Dr. Park had described. The gas chromatograph was newer, with capabilities for measuring trace atmospheric constituents down to parts per billion. There was also a device I didn't recognize, a squat metal box with multiple input ports and a display showing what looked like waveform patterns. A label on the side identified it as a temporal coherence analyzer, prototype V34. The user manual, sitting in a folder beside the device, was stamped with Helios Northern Research Corporation's logo and marked proprietary, do not reproduce. I flipped through it, trying to understand what temporal coherence meant in this context. The technical language was dense, full of references to quantum field states and spacetime metrics that were well outside my expertise, but the basic function seemed to be measuring something about how consistently matter maintained its properties over time. The manual included warnings about proper calibration and references to previous prototype versions that had produced unstable readings leading to observer disorientation. I closed the manual and tried to ignore the unease growing in my stomach. This was research equipment, I told myself. Specialized instruments for studying an unusual phenomenon. That's all. The fact that they developed custom devices for measuring temporal coherence didn't mean that time itself was behaving strangely. It just meant they were being thorough, exploring every possible explanation for the atmospheric anomalies. I started with a core from approximately 50 years ago, a section that should have been well within the modern industrial era, with atmospheric composition reflecting post-World War II increases in greenhouse gases and industrial pollutants. Standard extraction and analysis procedures. Remove the core from storage. Allow it to equilibrate to the working temperature of the processing station. Use the microtome to shave off a clean surface layer. Then extract the air bubbles using a needle and vacuum system that captured the gas for analysis. The gas chromatograph results appeared on the monitor after 20 minutes of processing, showing the relative concentrations of various atmospheric constituents. At first glance, everything looked normal: nitrogen at about 78%, oxygen at 21%, argon at roughly 1%, with trace amounts of carbon dioxide, neon, helium, and other gases. Exactly what you'd expect from mid-20th century atmosphere. But when I ran the isotope analysis, the results made me sit back and stare at the screen in confusion. The nitrogen isotope ratio was wrong. Not dramatically so, but enough to be noticeable. The ratio of nitrogen-15 to nitrogen-14 was elevated by about 2% above what it should have been for that time period, a difference that might seem small but was enormous in terms of atmospheric processes. Nitrogen isotope ratios are extremely stable, changing only over geological timescales through very specific mechanisms. A 2% elevation suggested the air in this bubble had been subjected to some process that preferentially removed nitrogen-14 or added nitrogen-15, and I couldn't think of any natural or artificial process that would do that. I ran the analysis again, using a different bubble from the same core section, wondering if I'd made an error in extraction or measurement. The results came back nearly identical: the same elevated nitrogen-15 ratio, the same 2% deviation from the expected value. So it wasn't measurement error. The air trapped in this ice was genuinely different from what it should have been. I moved to an older section, a core from approximately 200 years ago, pre-industrial atmosphere that should have been even more stable and predictable. The same pattern appeared: elevated nitrogen-15, though this time the deviation was only about 1%. I tried a section from 500 years ago, then 1,000 years ago, then 2,000 years ago, working backward through the ice record, and watched as the nitrogen isotope anomaly gradually diminished, approaching normal values as I went deeper into the past. This made no sense. If anything, I would have expected anomalies to be more pronounced in older ice, where the preservation might be less perfect, or where unknown ancient processes might have affected the atmospheric composition. Instead, the pattern suggested that whatever was causing the isotope anomalies had begun relatively recently in geological terms, within the last few centuries, and had been intensifying over time. I spent the next 6 hours working through more samples, building a dataset that confirmed the pattern. The nitrogen-15 elevation appeared first in ice dating to approximately 300 years ago, just a slight deviation barely at the edge of statistical significance. It grew progressively more pronounced in younger ice, following what looked almost like an exponential curve. By the time I reached the most recent samples, from ice formed within the last decade, the deviation had reached nearly 3%. I also noticed something else: something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up despite the cold of the laboratory. The anomalies weren't consistent within individual cores. A single section of ice, representing perhaps a year or two of snowfall accumulation, would show significant variation in the isotope ratios depending on which bubble I analyzed. Some bubbles were nearly normal, while others showed extreme deviations. It was as if the atmosphere itself had been heterogeneous during that period, with pockets of anomalous air mixed throughout the normal composition. Exactly what Dr. Park had described seeing at the anomaly site, but recorded here in ice that had formed 40 kilometers away. I was so absorbed in the analysis that I didn't notice the change in the room at first. It was only when I stood up to stretch my back, stiff from hours of hunching over the equipment, that I realized the far end of the laboratory looked different. The wall with the storage units seemed farther away than it should have been, the perspective subtly wrong, as if I were viewing it through a lens that distorted space. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The distortion persisted. The wall was simultaneously where it should be and somewhere else, the two positions overlapping in a way that made my vision blur when I tried to focus on it. I thought about what James had said. Report anything unusual immediately. Don't try to investigate it yourself. But I found myself walking toward the far end of the lab instead, drawn by a need to understand what I was seeing. As I moved closer, the distortion became more pronounced. The storage units seemed to recede as I approached them, maintaining a constant distance no matter how far I walked. I could see them clearly, could read the labels on their doors, could count the number of units, 12 in total, arranged in 2 rows of 6, but I couldn't seem to reach them. I stopped walking and turned around. The processing station where I'd been working was clearly visible behind me, perhaps 30 feet away, the exact distance I would have expected given how far I'd walked. But when I turned back to the storage units, they still appeared to be 30 feet away in the opposite direction. The room had somehow become longer than it should be, stretched in a way that violated basic geometry. A sound reached me then, not loud but clear in the profound silence of the basement level. It was a voice speaking words I couldn't quite make out, the syllables blurred and indistinct. The direction was impossible to pin down. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the air itself were speaking. I stood very still, listening, trying to identify the language or at least the tone. It didn't sound threatening, exactly. More contemplative, like someone thinking aloud while working through a complex problem. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding flat and strange in the distorted space. "Is someone there?" The voice stopped immediately, cut off mid-syllable. The silence that followed was absolute, oppressive, the kind of quiet that seems to absorb sound rather than merely exist in its absence. I waited, counting my breaths, watching for any sign of movement or change. Nothing. The distortion in the room's dimensions persisted, but the voice didn't return. I walked carefully back toward the processing station, keeping my eyes on it, and this time the distance felt correct, 30 feet of normal space that I crossed in the expected number of steps. When I reached the workbench, I turned to look at the far end of the lab again. The storage units were in their proper positions, the room's dimensions completely normal, as if the distortion had never existed. But my heart was racing, and my hands were shaking slightly as I pulled off my gloves. I should report this, I thought. That was the protocol. James had been explicit about it. But I found myself hesitating, uncertain how to describe what I'd experienced. A wall that seemed farther away than it should be. A voice with no identifiable source. It sounded absurd, like the complaints of someone whose grip on reality was slipping. And yet it had been real as the ice cores, as real as the anomalous isotope ratios in my data. I compromised by documenting the experience in my research notes, including the exact time and duration, my physical location in the lab, and the environmental conditions as shown by the monitors. Temperature at -15 Celsius, humidity at 12%, no fluctuations in air pressure or other measured parameters. Then I saved my analytical data, secured the ice cores back in their storage units, and left Lab 3, taking the stairs up to ground level with an uncomfortable feeling that something was watching me ascend. Though when I glanced back down the stairwell, there was nothing visible except the dim fluorescent lighting receding into the depths. It was approaching 1800 hours, time for dinner, though I'd lost track of time while working and was surprised to realize I'd missed lunch entirely. The common area was filling with people when I arrived, the usual subdued atmosphere of the meal periods. I collected food, some kind of stew that had probably started as freeze-dried rations, bread that was dense and slightly stale canned vegetables, and sat at a table near Lisa Torres, who was eating alone. "How was your first day?" she asked. "Interesting," I said carefully. "The ice cores are definitely showing anomalies. The isotope ratios are consistent with what Dr. Park described in the briefing." Consistent meaning wrong. Consistent meaning impossible if we assume normal atmospheric physics. I paused, wondering how much I should say, how much she already knew. "Have you worked here long?" 18 months. I was brought in to analyze rock samples from the anomaly site, or rather, from as close as we can get to it without setting up camp there. My specialty is petrochronology, dating rocks through radioactive decay processes. She took a bite of bread, chewed thoughtfully. "The samples show interesting patterns. Multiple rocks from the same geographical formation, presumably deposited at the same time by the same geological processes, giving radically different age dates. Some are consistent with the expected age of the Arctic bedrock, billions of years old. Others come back with ages of only a few million years, or even younger. It's as if time itself flows differently there, as if the normal progression from past to future has become disrupted. That's what the temporal coherence analyzer is measuring, isn't it? Whether time is behaving consistently." She nodded. "Among other things, the device is still experimental and I'm not entirely sure Evelyn, Dr. Park, fully understands what it's detecting. But the readings correlate with other anomalies, so it's clearly measuring something real." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Did something happen in Lab 3 today? You look shaken." I hesitated, then decided that if anyone would understand, it would be another researcher who'd been here long enough to experience the strangeness firsthand. The room's dimensions seemed wrong. The far wall appeared to be farther away than it should be, and I couldn't reach it. And I heard a voice, though there was no one else there. Lisa's expression didn't show surprise or skepticism, just a kind of weary recognition. The basement level gets like that sometimes, especially Lab 3, since it houses materials from the anomaly site. The ice cores carry something with them, some quality that doesn't entirely dissipate even after the ice is extracted and brought here. Most of us have experienced similar things. But what causes it? What's the mechanism? If we knew that, we'd be a lot closer to understanding the anomaly itself. She glanced around the common area, checking that no one was paying particular attention to our conversation. "The working theory, and this is very much unofficial, not something you'll find in any reports, is that the anomaly site is a location where the normal barriers between different times are thin or permeable. Past, present, future. They're not as separate there as they are in most of the universe. And objects or materials that spend time in close proximity to that location can become infected, for lack of a better word. They carry back some of that temporal instability. But why would atmospheric conditions from millions of years ago manifest at that specific location? I asked. What makes that patch of Arctic ice special? That's the question, isn't it? We've looked for everything. Geological formations that might create unusual conditions, buried impact craters that might have weakened the fabric of spacetime, evidence of human or pre-human activity that might have triggered something. Nothing. The site is unremarkable in every conventional way. Just ice and rock, no different from thousands of square miles of identical Arctic terrain. Yet there it is, this impossible pocket where the rules break down. Dr. Webb entered the common area then, and conversations around the room diminished as people became aware of his presence. He moved to the center of the space, his usual position when he had announcements to make, and waited until he had complete attention. "I've received the weather forecast for the next 10 days, he said without preamble. "We have a significant storm system moving in, expected to arrive in approximately 40 hours. Wind speeds up to 80 kilometers per hour, potential whiteout conditions, temperature dropping to -40 with wind chill. All exterior work is suspended effective immediately. Anyone with ongoing field projects needs to secure equipment and return to the station by 2200 hours tomorrow. Once the storm hits, we'll be in full lockdown until it passes. No exterior access for any reason. Make sure your quarters are stocked with any personal items you'll need for an extended period inside." A murmur of conversation rose after he finished, though it was muted, as if people were reluctant to speak too loudly. Arctic storms were a fact of life at facilities like this, something to be prepared for and endured. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the room that seemed disproportionate to a weather event, even a severe one. "What happens during lockdowns?" I asked Lisa quietly. "We stay inside mostly. Continue our work, maintain the facility, try not to get cabin fever. The station is designed to be completely self-sufficient for up to 6 months if necessary. We have food stores, water from melting snow, backup generators if the solar panels get covered. We'll be fine." She paused. "Though the storms do sometimes make the anomalies more pronounced. The baseline readings from the temporal coherence analyzers tend to fluctuate more during severe weather. We don't know if the storms affect whatever's causing the temporal instability, or if it's just that the atmospheric disturbances make the anomalies easier to detect." That night, I tried to sleep but found myself lying awake, listening to the silence and thinking about temporal instability, about air from the Cretaceous period somehow coexisting with modern atmosphere, about walls that receded as you approached them and voices that came from nowhere. My rational mind kept insisting that there had to be explanations, that science would ultimately make sense of these phenomena once we had enough data and the right theoretical framework. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since I arrived at Station Polaris, recognized that perhaps some phenomena existed beyond the reach of conventional scientific explanation, that the universe was stranger and more malleable than our theories allowed for. The next day, I returned to Lab 3 and continued my analysis, working through ice cores from progressively more recent time periods. The pattern held. Nitrogen isotope anomalies increasing over the last 3 centuries, with the most dramatic elevations appearing in the most recent decades. But I also started noticing other oddities in the data. Oxygen isotope ratios showed occasional spikes that didn't match any known climatic events. Trace gas concentrations fluctuated wildly within single core sections, suggesting impossible variations in atmospheric composition over periods of days or weeks. And in the very newest cores, from ice formed within the last 2 years, I found something that made me call Dr. Park down to the lab to confirm my findings. She arrived within 15 minutes, still wearing her outdoor gear from whatever work she'd been doing elsewhere in the station. I showed her the gas chromatograph readout from a bubble extracted from ice formed approximately 18 months ago. "This can't be right," I said. "The argon concentration is wrong." She studied the numbers, her expression unreadable. "Wrong how?" "It's too high. Argon-40 makes up about 0.93% of Earth's atmosphere, and that ratio has been stable for millions of years. It comes primarily from radioactive decay of potassium-40 in Earth's crust, a very slow process that produces a steady, predictable accumulation over geological time. But this bubble shows argon-40 at nearly 1.2%. That's a 25% elevation. And there's no process that could cause that in modern atmosphere. None that I know of. You can't add argon to the air in any significant quantity. It's a noble gas, chemically inert, and there are no industrial sources that would release it. The only way to get elevated argon-40 is to have air that's been sitting in contact with potassium-bearing rocks for an extended period, allowing more decay to occur. But that would take millions of years. I pulled up another data set on the monitor. What's more, when I checked the argon-36 levels, that's a primordial isotope that's been present since Earth's formation and doesn't change. They're normal. So somehow we have air with elevated argon-40 but normal argon-36, which is impossible. It's as if someone took normal atmosphere and added a dose of argon-40 from somewhere else. Park was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the screen. Then she pulled out a tablet and began making notes. "This is consistent with the direct measurements we took at the anomaly site," she said finally. "We saw similar argon anomalies there, along with elevated levels of various other isotopes that accumulate through radioactive decay. The interpretation was that we were somehow sampling air that had been aged, for lack of a better term. Air that had experienced more radioactive decay than should be possible in the normal time frame." "Air from the future," I said, hearing how absurd it sounded even as I said it. "Or air from a place where time passes differently, where a year of normal time might correspond to millennia or more of radioactive decay processes." She looked up from her tablet. "Have you analyzed the temporal coherence data for these samples yet?" "I haven't used that device at all. I'm not entirely sure I understand what it measures." "Let me show you." She moved to the temporal coherence analyzer, powered it on, and began configuring it while explaining. "Normal matter exists in a state of temporal coherence. All the particles that make up an object experience time at the same rate, moving forward along the same timeline. The device measures how consistently matter maintains this coherence. If you scan a normal ice sample, you'll see a flat baseline, indicating that all the water molecules and trapped air particles are aging at the standard rate. She extracted a small sample from one of the cores and placed it in the analyzer's measurement chamber. Now watch what happens with a sample from the anomaly zone. The display showed a waveform that fluctuated wildly, spiking and dropping in irregular patterns. Park pointed to the variations. This indicates temporal incoherence. Different parts of the sample are experiencing time at different rates. Some particles might be aging faster than normal, others slower, and the rates are constantly shifting. It's as if the sample exists partially in multiple different time frames simultaneously. I stared at the readout, trying to comprehend what it meant. And this is present in ice cores extracted 40 kilometers from the anomaly site. Yes, not as pronounced as in samples taken directly from the site, but definitely measurable. Whatever is causing the temporal instability has a radius of effect, and we're within it. The station itself, all of us, we're all experiencing subtle temporal fluctuations all the time, usually too small to notice, but occasionally large enough to cause the kinds of perceptual distortions you experienced yesterday. Is it dangerous? Long-term exposure to temporal instability, what does that do to human biology? Park's expression became carefully neutral. We don't know. We monitor everyone's health closely, run regular medical scans, watch for any signs of cellular abnormalities or accelerated aging. So far, we haven't detected any obvious physical effects, but we also don't have a theoretical framework for predicting what might happen. We're in completely uncharted territory. She helped me set up the temporal coherence analyzer to run automatically on each sample I processed, adding that data to my growing data set. Then she left, and I continued working through the afternoon, building a comprehensive picture of how the anomalies had developed over the past 3 centuries. The pattern was unmistakable. Something had begun affecting the atmospheric composition around 300 years ago, subtle at first but progressively intensifying, with the rate of change accelerating dramatically in recent decades. By the time I broke for dinner, the storm Webb had warned about was beginning to manifest. The wind had picked up, creating a low moan that penetrated even the heavily insulated walls of the station. Through the windows of the common area, I could see snow beginning to fall. Not the gentle flakes of a normal snowfall, but hard particles driven nearly horizontal by the wind, reducing visibility to a few meters. The world outside was becoming a wall of white, the boundary between ground and sky dissolving into uniform blankness. The storm hit in full force around midnight. I'd returned to my quarters after dinner, intending to review my notes and prepare for the next day's analysis, but the sound of the wind made concentration impossible. It wasn't just the volume, though that was considerable, a constant roar that vibrated through the building structure, but the quality. The wind seemed to have voices in it, syllables and phrases that weren't quite language but weren't quite random noise either. I told myself it was pareidolia, the human tendency to find patterns in randomness, but the illusion was persistent and unnervingly convincing. I tried to sleep, but the voices in the wind kept pulling me back to wakefulness. And there was something else, a sensation I couldn't quite name, a feeling of pressure or presence, as if the storm outside was pushing against the walls not just with physical force but with some other kind of energy. The air in my room felt thick, resistant, as if I were breathing something denser than normal atmosphere. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went down to the common area, thinking that being around other people might help ground me in normalcy. I wasn't the only one awake. Half a dozen others were scattered around the space. Mikkel at one of the tables, working on a laptop. 2 researchers I hadn't been formally introduced to, playing cards, Patricia standing by one of the windows, staring out at the storm with an expression of intense concentration. I poured coffee from the perpetual urn and joined Patricia at the window. Up close, the storm was hypnotic, the snow moving in strange patterns, swirling and eddying in ways that seemed to defy the wind direction, occasionally organizing into shapes that almost looked deliberate before dissolving back into chaos. "Can't sleep?" Patricia asked without looking away from the window. "The wind," I said. "It sounds like voices." "It always does during the big storms. Some people hear them more clearly than others. I've been here 3 years and I still can't quite convince myself it's just random noise." She pointed at a section of the storm where the snow seemed to be moving in a tight spiral, a vortex perhaps 2 meters across. "Watch that. Tell me if you see it too." I focused on the area she'd indicated. At first, it was just swirling snow, chaotic and meaningless. Then, for just a moment, perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, the pattern resolved into something that looked almost like a figure, a human shape sketched in white against white, before dissipating back into randomness. "I saw it," I said quietly. "They appear during every major storm. Snow devils, we call them, though that's not really accurate. They're not whirlwinds or any kind of normal atmospheric phenomenon. They're more like projections, maybe, images of something that's being reflected or manifested in the storm." She finally turned to look at me. "You're a scientist. You want things to make sense, to follow logical patterns. That's good. We need that rigor, that insistence on evidence and repeatability. But there's a point you'll reach working here, where you have to accept that some phenomena are beyond current scientific explanation. Not forever, perhaps, but for now. Fighting that acceptance, trying to force these observations into conventional frameworks, that's what breaks people." "Is that what happened to the researchers who left early?" I asked. "They couldn't accept what they were seeing." "Some of them. Others accepted it too readily, lost their critical faculties, started seeing patterns and meanings where there weren't any. The trick is to walk the line between rigid skepticism and uncritical belief. Observe carefully, document thoroughly, but don't expect immediate explanations." She moved away from the window. "Try to get some sleep, Dr. Chen. The storm will last at least another 36 hours, and you'll need to stay sharp." I returned to my room, and this time I did manage to sleep, though my dreams were strange and fragmented, images of ice cores that grew teeth and whispered secrets, of laboratories where the walls breathed and the floors were made of frozen time. I woke to my alarm feeling more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed, my mouth dry and my head aching. The storm continued through that day and the next, confining all of us to the interior of the station. I worked in Lab 3, grateful for the distraction of the analysis, though the temporal incoherence readings were showing more variation than they had before the storm began. The ice cores themselves seemed to be fluctuating, the anomalies more pronounced, as if the atmospheric disturbance outside was affecting the samples even though they were sealed in climate-controlled storage. On the 3rd day, the storm began to abate. The wind diminished from a roar to a howl to a steady whisper, and by evening it had stopped entirely. The silence that followed was profound, almost painful after days of constant noise. When I looked out the window of my room, the world had been transformed. Snow had drifted against the buildings in sculptural waves, some reaching nearly to the 2nd-story windows. The sky was clear, stars brilliant overhead, and the moon cast long blue shadows across the transformed landscape. Dr. Webb called a meeting in the common area after dinner to discuss post-storm operations. Several exterior structures needed to be cleared of snow. The solar panels required cleaning, and various monitoring instruments that had been shut down during the storm needed to be reactivated and recalibrated. Work crews were organized, schedules established. I wasn't assigned to any exterior duties. My work was entirely inside, but I listened to the planning, absorbing details about the facility's operations. What I noticed, and what disturbed me more than it probably should have, was that the count was off. I'd been keeping a mental tally of the people I'd seen around the station: researchers, support staff, the handful of technicians who maintained the equipment. Before the storm, my count had been consistent: 17 people total, including myself. But at this meeting, I counted 19. 2 additional people were present: a woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and a man perhaps in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard. Both were dressed like the rest of us in practical work clothes. Both participated normally in the discussion, and no one else seemed to notice anything unusual about their presence. I told myself I'd simply miscounted before, that perhaps these 2 had been away when I first arrived or had been working in parts of the station I hadn't visited. But that rationalization felt hollow. I'd been here for nearly a week, had eaten meals in the common area at the standard times, had been introduced to the research staff. If these 2 had been present, I would have met them. After the meeting ended, I approached Lisa Torres quietly. "The woman with the dark ponytail," I said, trying to sound casual. "I don't think we've been introduced. What's her specialty?" Lisa looked puzzled. "What woman?" "Dark hair, ponytail, maybe mid-30s. She was sitting near the back during the meeting." "Sarah, there was no one matching that description at the meeting. Are you feeling all right?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. And the older man with the beard, salt and pepper, sitting near Dr. Webb. Her expression shifted from puzzlement to concern. "You should talk to Dr. Park. This is the kind of observation that needs to be documented." But when I looked back across the room, trying to locate the 2 people I'd seen, they were gone. The common area held only the people I recognized, the familiar faces of the Station Polaris crew. 17 people, the count I'd expected. No extras, no additions. I found Dr. Park in her office, a small room off one of the second-floor corridors, lined with filing cabinets and computer equipment. When I described what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, she pulled out a form and began taking notes, her expression professionally neutral. "Did these individuals interact with anyone else?" she asked. "Did they speak during the meeting?" They seemed to, yes. They were participating in the discussion about snow removal operations, but no one else acknowledged them specifically. It was as if they were part of the group, but also somehow separate. "And when did you first notice them?" "At the meeting. I hadn't seen them before." She made more notes, then pulled up something on her computer, what looked like a database or log file. "This isn't the first report of additional people appearing in the station. We've had similar observations from other researchers, usually during or shortly after major storms. The pattern seems to be that individuals will perceive extra staff members who integrate seamlessly into the group, participating in normal activities, but who don't actually exist in any official capacity." "You're saying I hallucinated 2 people, that they weren't real?" "I'm saying that you perceived 2 people who may or may not have had physical existence in the conventional sense. The distinction is important. These aren't simple visual hallucinations. They're not transparent or obviously unreal. They appear solid, they cast shadows, they interact with the environment. But they also don't show up on security cameras, don't appear in photographs, and vanish when directly confronted or questioned. Whatever they are, they're more complex than simple perceptual errors. Temporal echoes, I suggested, though even saying it felt absurd. People from different times who are somehow bleeding through into our present. That's one theory. Another is that they're projections of some kind, mental constructs generated by whatever force is causing the anomalies, designed to appear human and blend in with our activities. A third possibility is that they're actually us, or versions of us, from slightly different timelines that temporarily overlap with our own. She closed the log file. We don't know. What we do know is that these appearances are harmless. The figures never behave threateningly, never try to prevent people from leaving areas or accessing equipment. They simply exist, briefly, and then cease to exist. I left her office feeling profoundly unsettled, and that night I barely slept at all. Every shadow in my room seemed to hold potential figures. Every creak of the building suggested movement that shouldn't be there. The rational part of my mind insisted that I'd simply made an error, miscounted, confused someone's appearance, let the stress and isolation affect my perception. But I kept seeing those two faces in my memory, clear, distinct, as real as anyone else at the meeting. How could that level of detail be a hallucination? The next morning, I forced myself back into routine, returning to Lab 3 to continue the ice core analysis. I was nearing the end of the available cores, working with sections from the most recent year, and the data was showing the most extreme anomalies yet. The nitrogen isotope elevations had reached nearly 4% in some bubbles. The argon-40 levels were jumping between normal and dramatically elevated values within single core sections. And the temporal coherence readings were chaotic, showing fluctuations that suggested the ice had experienced wildly varying rates of time passage, even after being extracted from the ground. I was in the process of running a particularly anomalous sample through the mass spectrometer when the lights in Lab 3 flickered. Not a brief flicker, a sustained dimming that lasted several seconds, the fluorescent tubes dropping to perhaps 20% of their normal output before gradually brightening again. The equipment continued running, powered by a separate system, but the dimming had been pronounced enough to make me look up from my work. When I did, I saw that the far end of the laboratory had changed again. The wall with the storage units was visibly farther away than it should be, and this time the distortion was more pronounced. The room seemed to stretch into a distance that couldn't possibly exist within the station's physical structure, the ceiling and floor converging toward a vanishing point that should have been 30 feet away, but appeared to be hundreds of feet distant. I stood up slowly, keeping the processing station between myself and the distorted space, and reached for the intercom panel on the wall. Protocol was clear. Report anomalies immediately. Don't investigate alone. But before I could press the call button, a figure emerged from the distant space. It was one of the people I'd seen at the meeting, the woman with the dark ponytail. She walked toward me from that impossible distance, her footsteps making no sound on the laboratory floor, her movements smooth and unhurried. As she approached, the distortion in the room's dimensions seemed to follow her, as if she carried that stretched space with her like an aura. She stopped perhaps 10 feet from where I stood, close enough that I could see her face clearly, could note the details of her appearance. Brown eyes, a small scar above her left eyebrow, dark circles suggesting inadequate sleep. "Dr. Chen," she said, and her voice was clear but strange, as if it was coming from slightly the wrong direction. You're analyzing the cores from Sector 7, grid reference NUF 4471. Is that correct? I couldn't make myself speak, could only nod. The atmospheric samples from that sector show temporal displacement averaging 47 million years relative to present, she continued, as if discussing routine data. The nitrogen isotope elevations you're measuring represent decay processes that occurred during the Eocene epoch, when Earth's climate was significantly warmer and atmospheric composition was markedly different. What you're seeing is not contamination or instrumental error. It's genuine Eocene atmosphere, somehow manifesting in present-day ice formation. That's impossible, I managed to say. Yes, she agreed, which is why documentation is critical. The data you're collecting will be essential for understanding the progression of the anomaly. In 3 weeks, the temporal displacement will increase by approximately 20%. In 6 weeks, you'll begin detecting atmospheric samples from the Cretaceous period pre-Kt extinction event. This progression must be carefully monitored and recorded. Who are you? What are you? She tilted her head slightly, an oddly mechanical gesture. I'm someone who has access to information you don't yet possess. Future observations, data from analyses not yet conducted. I'm here to ensure that the necessary measurements are made, that the patterns are recognized. She took a step closer, and the distortion in the room intensified, making my vision blur. The anomaly is not static, Dr. Chen. It's growing, expanding both spatially and temporally. What began as a localized phenomenon is becoming more widespread, affecting a larger area with greater intensity. This station exists at the boundary of that expansion, close enough to study it, but far enough to maintain relative stability. For now. What happens when the anomaly reaches the station? Temporal coherence breaks down completely. Past, present, and future lose their distinct boundaries. Causality becomes malleable. Matter exists in superposition across multiple time frames. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested sadness or perhaps regret. Continue your work, Dr. Chen. Document everything. The data matters, even if the interpretation isn't immediately clear. She turned and walked back toward the far end of the laboratory, and as she moved away, the distortion diminished. The wall with the storage units gradually returned to its proper position, the impossible distance collapsing back into normal 30-foot dimensions. When she reached the far wall, she didn't stop or turn. She simply continued walking, passing through the solid barrier as if it were mist, and disappeared. I stood motionless for a long time, my heart hammering, trying to process what I'd witnessed. Then I grabbed my notebook and wrote down everything she'd said, word for word as best I could remember, along with details of her appearance and behavior. Only after I documented it all did I press the intercom button and request that Dr. Park come to Lab 3 immediately. She arrived within minutes, and I described the encounter while it was still fresh in my memory. Park listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her expression growing more serious as I continued. Did she touch anything? Park asked when I'd finished. Interact with any of the equipment or physical objects? No, she just walked in, spoke to me, and walked out through the wall. And the information she provided about Eocene atmosphere, about future increases in temporal displacement, did any of that align with your current data? I pulled up my analysis results on the monitor, showing her the latest isotope measurements. If what she said is accurate, and these really are samples from the Eocene, then yes, the numbers make sense. The nitrogen 15 elevation, the argon 40 levels, even some of the trace gas concentrations. They're all consistent with what we'd expect from atmosphere that's been aging through radioactive decay for 47 million years. I paused. But that means I'm detecting air from a time when this location would have been underwater, when the Arctic was warmer and forested. How does atmosphere from the Eocene end up in ice formed last year? That's the question we've been trying to answer for 4 years, Park said quietly. And we're no closer to understanding it than when we started. Every analysis reveals more impossibilities, more violations of physical law. It's as if the anomaly doesn't just affect the present. It reaches backward and forward through time, creating connections between eras that should be completely separate. She spent the next hour conducting her own measurements of the laboratory, using a portable version of the temporal coherence analyzer to scan the space where the figure had appeared. The readings showed significant residual temporal displacement, especially near the far wall where she'd vanished. Park documented everything methodically, adding my report to what was apparently a substantial file of similar encounters. How often does this happen? I asked. People seeing figures, having conversations with impossible entities. Often enough that we have protocols for it. Not daily, but several times a week across the station. Most encounters are brief, a figure glimpsed in peripheral vision, a voice heard in an empty room, shadows that move independently. What you experienced is more intensive, more direct interaction. Those are rarer. She looked at me closely. How are you holding up? This environment can be psychologically taxing, especially for newcomers. I'm fine, I said automatically, though I wasn't certain that was true. It's disturbing, but intellectually fascinating. If these phenomena are real, and the evidence suggests they are, then we're observing something unprecedented. A breakdown in the normal structure of spacetime, causality becoming negotiable. I struggled for words. That's potentially the most important scientific discovery in history. Or the most dangerous, Park said. We don't know what's causing this, which means we don't know if it can be controlled or reversed. If the temporal anomaly continues expanding at its current rate, within 5 years it will encompass Utqiagvik. Within 10 years, a significant portion of the Arctic. Within 20. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Has anyone tried to stop it? To contain or neutralize whatever's causing the effect? We can't stop something we don't understand. Every intervention we've attempted, electromagnetic shielding, thermal modification, even physical barriers, has had no measurable impact. The anomaly continues its progression regardless of what we do. Our role here is purely observational at this point. We document, we measure, we try to predict the expansion pattern, but we can't prevent it. After she left, I tried to return to my work, but concentration was impossible. The woman's words kept echoing in my mind. In 3 weeks, the temporal displacement will increase by approximately 20%. In 6 weeks, you'll begin detecting atmospheric samples from the Cretaceous period. That kind of specific prediction suggested she had access to data from the future, that she had somehow observed the progression of the anomaly past the point where I currently stood in time. Which raised an uncomfortable question. If she was from the future, if she had witnessed what happened in the weeks and months ahead, why hadn't she warned me about anything dangerous? Why provide clinical information about isotope measurements but nothing about potential hazards or threats? Unless there was nothing to warn about. Unless whatever happened to me, to all of us at Station Polaris, was inevitable, not worth warning about because no warning could change the outcome. I forced myself to continue processing samples, building my dataset with mechanical precision, even as my thoughts spiraled into increasingly dark speculation. The ice cores told a story of progressive temporal contamination, ancient atmospheres bleeding into the present at accelerating rates. And if the pattern held, if the woman's prediction was accurate, then within weeks I'd be detecting air from even further back, from the age of dinosaurs, from a world so different from the present that its very atmosphere would be alien. The next few days passed in a rhythm of work and disturbed sleep. I continued analyzing cores, watching the anomalies intensify exactly as predicted. I attended meals in the common area, participated in the minimal social interaction that Station Polaris permitted, and tried not to stare too intently at my colleagues, wondering if any of them were real or if some might be temporal projections, echoes from other times wearing human faces. I counted obsessively now, 17 people, always 17, except when it wasn't. Twice more I saw additional figures at meals, people who seemed to belong but whose presence no one else acknowledged. I stopped reporting these sightings after the first few, recognizing that Park already had extensive documentation, and that repeated reports were accomplishing nothing except marking me as someone who was struggling with the environment. But I was struggling. The silence of the station had become oppressive, that profound quiet that seemed to absorb sound rather than merely exist without it. I found myself making unnecessary noise just to break it, humming while working, tapping my pen against the desk, letting doors close harder than necessary. The isolation was wearing on me too, despite my previous confidence that I could handle solitude. There was a difference between chosen isolation and enforced confinement, between being alone in a place that felt normal and being trapped in a location where reality itself was negotiable. 2 weeks after my arrival, I was working late in Lab 3 when the lights went out completely. Not a flicker or dimming this time, but instant total darkness, the kind of absolute black that's disorienting in its completeness. Emergency lights should have activated immediately. They were legally required in research facilities, designed to provide minimum illumination during power failures. But nothing came on. I was alone in the dark, deep in the basement level, with no light source. I fumbled for my phone, found it in my pocket, activated the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating equipment and furniture in stark relief, creating harsh shadows that seemed to move independently of the objects casting them. I swept the light around the room, checking for anything unusual, and saw that the far wall had distorted again. But this time, instead of appearing farther away, it looked closer, as if the room had compressed, the space contracting rather than expanding. Then I heard footsteps, multiple sets, approaching from various directions, though there was only one door to the laboratory. The sounds were clear, distinct boot falls on the concrete floor, coming from the compressed space at the far end of the room and from the walls on either side. I turned the phone light toward the sounds, and figures emerged from the darkness. There were 5 of them, all dressed in cold weather gear similar to what we wore at the station, but subtly different. The parkas were an older style, the boots a different design. They moved toward me with purposeful strides, and as they came into the full illumination of my phone light, I could see their faces. All 5 were looking directly at me with expressions of intense concern or perhaps fear, their mouths moving as if they were speaking, but no sound reached me except the continued footsteps. The closest figure, a man in his 40s with a frost-rimmed beard, reached out toward me, his hand extending in what might have been a warning gesture or perhaps a request for help. I stepped backward instinctively, and as I moved, the figures flickered, becoming translucent for a moment before solidifying again. They continued advancing, all 5 of them now extending their hands toward me, their silent mouths forming words I couldn't hear. I backed up against the processing station, trapped, and the figures stopped about 6 feet away, their hands still outstretched. We remained in that frozen tableau for perhaps 10 seconds, and then the lights came back on, not gradually but instantly, full fluorescent brightness flooding the laboratory. The figures were gone, the room's dimensions were normal, and I was alone with my hammering heart and the echo of footsteps that were no longer there. This time I didn't hesitate. I secured the lab immediately, climbing the stairs 2 at a time, and went directly to Dr. Park's office. She listened to my account with growing concern, then made a phone call to Dr. Webb, requesting an immediate meeting. Within 20 minutes, the 3 of us were in conference room A, and Park was pulling up files on her laptop, images and video recordings I hadn't seen before. "What you're describing matches several previous incidents," Webb said. "Specifically, encounters with what we call Category 3 manifestations, multiple figures exhibiting coordinated behavior, apparent awareness of the observer, and attempts at communication." He gestured to Park, who turned her laptop screen toward me. The image showed a photograph taken in what looked like one of the station's corridors. I could see the distinctive beige walls, the fluorescent lighting, the numbered doors. But superimposed over the normal environment were translucent figures, perhaps a dozen of them, crowded together in postures that suggested panic or desperation. Some were looking directly at the camera, their mouths open in silent screams. Others were turned away, appearing to run toward or away from something outside the frame. "This was taken by one of our technicians 8 months ago," Park explained. "He was walking down the second-floor corridor when his phone camera activated spontaneously and captured this image. He didn't see the figures directly. They only appeared in the photograph." "Who are they?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. "We don't know for certain," Webb said. "But the clothing styles, the equipment visible in some images, they suggest these are researchers or staff from different time periods. Some appear to be from the past based on their gear. Others might be from the future, wearing designs we don't recognize. The working theory is that they're trapped in temporal eddies, experiencing their own version of Station Polaris that overlaps spatially with ours but exists at different points in time." "You're saying this station has existed across multiple timelines, that there are other versions of it, other crews experiencing similar phenomena?" "Not exactly. Station Polaris was established 7 years ago. That's a concrete fact. But the anomalies' influence on spacetime means that temporally, this location might have different histories, different possible timelines that haven't fully collapsed into a single definite past. What we see as our present moment might coexist with other presents from adjacent timelines, all occupying the same spatial coordinates but separated by temporal displacement." Park pulled up another file, a video this time. The footage showed Lab 3, filmed from the perspective of someone standing near the door. The lab looked normal at first, but then figures began appearing in the frame, not suddenly but gradually, fading in like developing photographs. They moved through the space with purpose, interacting with equipment, writing notes, conducting what appeared to be normal research activities. But they were translucent, ghostly, and they passed through solid objects without noticing them. "This footage was captured by our security system 2 years ago," Park said. "Watch what happens at the 30-second mark." I watched. At 30 seconds, one of the translucent figures, a woman in her 30s, turned and looked directly at the camera. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, and her expression was one of profound distress. She approached the camera, reaching out, and her hand passed through the lens as if it were empty air. Then all the figures vanished simultaneously, and the lab returned to its normal empty state. "We've documented hundreds of similar incidents," Webb said. "The temporal overlaps are becoming more frequent and more pronounced. What began as occasional glimpses and brief sounds has progressed to full visual manifestations that persist for minutes at a time. The boundary between different timelines is weakening, allowing more interaction between them. And the figures I saw tonight, the 5 people trying to warn me or communicate with me, they're from one of these adjacent timelines. Most likely, based on their clothing and the urgency of their behavior, we believe they're from a timeline that's slightly ahead of ours temporally, perhaps by weeks or months. They've experienced something we haven't yet encountered, and they're trying to convey information across the temporal boundary. But communication is extremely difficult when the timelines aren't fully aligned." I thought about the woman who had appeared in the lab 2 weeks ago, who had provided specific predictions about the progression of the anomaly. What if they're trying to warn us about what happens when the anomaly reaches critical intensity, when the temporal displacement becomes so extreme that the station itself loses coherence? Webb and Park exchanged a long look. Finally, Webb spoke. "That's our concern as well, which is why we're implementing new protocols, effective immediately. All personnel are now required to work in pairs when in isolated areas of the facility. No one goes to the basement level alone. We're also installing additional monitoring equipment throughout the station to better track temporal fluctuations and provide advance warning of major manifestation events. And if the warnings come too late, if whatever they're experiencing in those other timelines happens to us before we can evacuate." Station Polaris is equipped with emergency shelters, reinforced spaces with their own life support systems, designed to withstand extreme conditions. If temporal coherence breaks down to the point where the main facility becomes unsafe, we'll retreat to the shelters and await rescue." He paused. "Though I'll be honest, Dr. Chen, we don't know if the shelters will provide any real protection against temporal displacement. They were designed for conventional hazards, storms, fires, structural failures, not for breakdowns in the fundamental nature of time." That night, I lay awake in my quarters, staring at the ceiling and trying to decide whether I should request early termination of my contract. The money was excellent. The research was unprecedented, but I was beginning to understand why some researchers chose to leave before their contracts ended. There was a level of existential horror in this place that went beyond physical danger. The knowledge that reality itself was unreliable, that the walls between past, present, and future were permeable, that you might encounter versions of yourself or your colleagues from timelines that had diverged in subtle or catastrophic ways. But I didn't leave, partly because I needed the money, partly because the scientific significance of the work was too important to abandon, but mostly because I was beginning to recognize something in myself that I hadn't fully acknowledged before. I was drawn to this strangeness, fascinated by the breakdown of natural law in ways that should probably concern me. The horror was real, but so was the compulsion to understand, to witness, to document these impossible phenomena. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of work and mounting tension. The ice core analysis continued to show exactly what the mysterious woman had predicted: temporal displacements increasing by approximately 20%, atmospheric samples showing progressively older signatures. By the end of the 3rd week, I was detecting isotope ratios consistent with atmosphere from the late Cretaceous period, from an Earth 90 million years in the past. The manifestations throughout the station intensified as well. Figures appeared in common areas during meals, sitting at tables or standing in corners, visible to some people and not to others. Voices echoed through corridors at night, speaking in languages that ranged from recognizable English to completely unknown phonetic structures. Objects moved on their own, books shifting position on shelves, doors opening and closing without apparent cause, equipment activating spontaneously. And the room dimensions continued to distort. Several times I watched as corridors stretched or compressed, doors leading to spaces that shouldn't exist, windows showing views that didn't match the station's actual orientation. Mikkel reported getting lost for 40 minutes in what should have been a simple walk from the common area to his quarters, finding himself in sections of the station he didn't recognize, with room numbers that didn't exist in the official layout. Dr. Park's temporal coherence measurements showed that the entire station was now experiencing significant fluctuations, with some areas aging faster than others, time flowing at subtly different rates in different rooms. She calculated that someone working in Lab 3 for an 8-hour shift might experience 8 hours and 15 minutes subjectively, while someone in the common area during the same period would experience only 7 hours and 40 minutes. The differences were small but measurable, and they were growing. On my 25th day at Station Polaris, I was working alone in Lab 3 despite the new protocols. My assigned partner, a technician named David, had called in sick with what he described as severe disorientation and nausea, symptoms that were becoming increasingly common as the temporal fluctuations intensified. I debated whether to skip my work session for the day, but I was close to completing the core analysis, and the scientist in me wanted to finish the data set before anything else went wrong. I was extracting a sample from one of the deepest cores, ice from approximately 11,000 years ago when the lights dimmed again. But this time, instead of going dark, they shifted in color, the normal white fluorescence taking on a strange amber quality, as if the spectrum itself had changed. The temperature in the lab dropped precipitously, my breath suddenly visible in great clouds, frost forming on the equipment's surfaces within seconds. And the walls became transparent. Not invisible, transparent like glass, showing what lay beyond them. Except what I saw through the walls wasn't the adjacent rooms and corridors of Station Polaris. It was ice, solid ice extending in all directions, the frozen ground of the Arctic reaching down into darkness below and up toward a surface I couldn't see above. I was looking at the station's location as it existed before the buildings were constructed, or perhaps after they'd been removed or destroyed. I was seeing through the walls into a different time. Figures moved in that ice, dark shapes that might have been human or might have been something else, swimming or crawling through the frozen water as if it were liquid. They approached the transparent walls of the laboratory, pressing against them from the outside, their forms distorted by the ice but clearly aware of my presence. I could see faces, or at least approximations of faces, features that were almost human but arranged wrong, with too many or too few of certain characteristics. One shape pressed particularly close, and as I watched, it began to push through the wall, the ice parting around it like a membrane. The figure emerged into the laboratory space, bringing with it a wave of cold so intense that I gasped, my lungs burning. It stood perhaps 7 feet tall, its body simultaneously solid and translucent, its surface covered with what might have been frost or scales or something else entirely. When it turned to look at me, I saw that its eyes were wrong, not missing or deformed, but fundamentally different. as if evolution had taken a different path and produced organs of vision that operated on different principles. It moved toward me, not walking but flowing, its form shifting and adapting to the environment. I backed away until I hit the processing station, trapped again, and the entity stopped a few feet from me. Then it spoke, or at least it produced sounds that might have been language. The syllables were harsh, grinding like ice scraping against stone, but there was pattern in them, rhythm that suggested communication. And somehow, impossibly, I understood. Not the words themselves, those remained incomprehensible noise, but the meaning behind them reached me directly, bypassing language entirely. It was showing me images, concepts, information that appeared in my mind without passing through my senses. I saw the anomaly not as we perceived it, as an atmospheric phenomenon, a location where time behaved strangely, but as it truly was, a wound in spacetime, a place where the normal separation between moments had broken down completely. I understood that the wound was growing, spreading outward from its epicenter 40 kilometers north of the station, consuming space and time as it expanded. I understood that within this wound, all times existed simultaneously. Past, present, and future collapsed into a single eternal moment where causality had no meaning. I understood that the atmospheric anomalies, the temporal overlaps, the manifestations throughout the station, these were just symptoms, surface effects of a much deeper distortion in the fabric of reality. And I understood that the entity showing me these things was not from the past or future, but from the wound itself, a consciousness that had adapted to exist in that impossible space where time had no direction, a being that experienced all moments simultaneously and could navigate between them at will. It showed me more, the progression of the wound's growth, the timeline of its expansion. In 6 weeks, it would reach Station Polaris. In 3 months, it would encompass Utqiagvik. In a year, it would spread across the Arctic, a zone where temporal coherence had completely broken down, where anyone entering would experience all their possible timelines simultaneously, living through every version of their life that could have existed. And then it showed me the choice. Stay and document the final progression. Gather the data that might allow future researchers to understand and perhaps eventually contain the wound. Or leave now, evacuate while transportation was still reliable, save myself while accepting that the opportunity to observe and record this phenomenon would be lost. The entity withdrew then, flowing back toward the transparent wall, merging with the ice beyond. The amber light faded, the normal fluorescent brightness returning. The walls became opaque again, solid beige surfaces showing no hint of the frozen landscape beyond. The temperature rose to its normal, uncomfortable chill, and I was alone in Lab 3 with a choice I hadn't wanted and information I couldn't ignore. I left the laboratory without securing the equipment, climbing the stairs in a daze, and went directly to Dr. Webb's office. He was there, working late as usual, and he looked up as I entered without knocking. "I need to know," I said without preamble. "The evacuation protocols, are they real? If we call for extraction now, tonight, will someone actually come get us? Or are we trapped here until the wound reaches the station?" Webb set down his pen carefully, his expression unreadable. "Who told you about the wound?" "Does it matter? I need to know if evacuation is possible." "It's possible," he said slowly. "Helios maintains transport capability from Utqiagvik. If we call for extraction with sufficient justification, they'll send aircraft within 24 hours, weather permitting. but leaving now means abandoning the research at its most critical phase. The data you're collecting, the observations we're all making, this is potentially the most important scientific work in human history. Walking away from it because of fear. It's not fear, I interrupted. It's calculation. That entity showed me the timeline. The wound reaches us in 6 weeks. If we stay until then, we'll be caught in it, experiencing temporal breakdown directly. And while that might generate interesting observations, it also means we likely won't be able to transmit the data or even preserve it in comprehensible form. If we want this research to matter, if we want the documentation to reach the outside world, we need to evacuate before the wound arrives. Webb was silent for a long moment. What entity? I described the encounter, the ice becoming transparent, the being that had emerged and communicated directly with my mind. As I spoke, Webb's expression shifted from skepticism to troubled acceptance. Category 4 manifestation, he said when I finished. We've only had 3 previous reports of direct contact with non-human entities emerging from the anomaly zone. Each time, the being provided information that later proved accurate. If what you were shown is correct, then yes, we need to begin evacuation procedures immediately. Will everyone leave, or will some choose to stay? That's not my decision to make. Everyone here is an adult, a professional who understood the risks when they signed their contracts. I'll present the information, explain the timeline, and let people decide for themselves. He stood up, moving toward the door. But I suspect you know what most of them will choose. We're scientists. We came here to study the impossible. When offered the chance to observe something no human has ever witnessed, most of us won't walk away, no matter the personal cost. He was right. When Webb called an emergency meeting and presented the information, carefully explaining that it came from a Category 4 manifestation and therefore should be treated as credible but not certain, the response was immediate and nearly unanimous. Out of 17 people at Station Polaris, only 4 chose to leave. David the technician, whose disorientation had become debilitating, 2 support staff who had families waiting for them, and myself. I hadn't planned to leave. Right up until Webb asked for a show of hands, I'd intended to stay, to see this through to whatever conclusion awaited. But when the moment came, I thought about the frozen figures in the ice, the beings that had adapted to exist in temporal chaos, and I recognized that I didn't want to become that. I didn't want to experience all my possible timelines simultaneously, to exist in a state where past and future had no meaning, where every choice I might have made became equally real. The evacuation was scheduled for 36 hours later, enough time to secure critical equipment and data, to back up files to off-site servers, to prepare the station for whatever transformation awaited it. I spent those hours in Lab 3, finishing my core analysis with mechanical precision, writing up my findings in detailed reports that I uploaded to Helios's secure servers. The work was almost meditative, a way to avoid thinking about what I was leaving behind and what the others were choosing to endure. On the final night, I found myself in the common area with the 13 who were staying. The atmosphere was strange, not quite celebratory, but not somber either. More like the feeling before a long expedition into unknown territory, a mixture of anticipation and resignation. Lisa Torres sat beside me, and we shared a pot of bad coffee while pretending everything was normal. "You should go," she said quietly. "You have students, research projects, a life outside this place. I've been doing Arctic work for 20 years, and this is the culmination of everything I've studied. I need to see how it resolves. What do you think will happen when the wound reaches the station? I think we'll experience something no human has experienced before. That's worth staying for. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. And who knows? Maybe we'll be able to communicate back, send information from inside the wound to researchers outside it. Maybe the data we gather in those final weeks will be the key to understanding the whole phenomenon. Or maybe you'll just cease to exist in any conventional sense, trapped in temporal superposition with no way to convey what you're experiencing. That too, she admitted, but not knowing that's worse than any outcome. Thomas Greaves arrived at first light, his twin otter touching down on the packed snow runway with the same casual skill I remembered from my arrival. The four of us who were leaving gathered our minimal belongings. We'd been told to pack light, essentials only, and said brief goodbyes to the others. No one made speeches or emotional declarations. This was a scientific facility, and we maintained professional composure to the end. As the plane lifted off, I looked back at Station Polaris, that cluster of blue-gray buildings against the endless white expanse. From the air, it looked utterly ordinary, indistinguishable from dozens of other research facilities scattered across the Arctic. There was no visible sign of the temporal wound growing inexorably toward it, no indication that in 6 weeks those buildings would exist in all times simultaneously, their solid walls becoming permeable to past and future. The flight to Utqiagvik took 4 hours, and then another day of travel before I reached Anchorage, another day before I was back in Seattle. The transition was jarring, from the profound silence of Station Polaris to the constant noise of urban life, from the monochrome landscape of ice and sky to the visual chaos of a modern city. I felt dislocated, uncertain, as if I'd returned to a world that was real but less true than the place I'd left behind. I submitted my reports to Helios Northern Research Corporation and fulfilled the terms of my confidentiality agreement by discussing the work with no one outside the organization. The university welcomed me back, my department chair pleased with the contract money that had flowed through our accounts, unconcerned with the details of what I'd actually been doing in the Arctic. I resumed teaching, advising students, attending faculty meetings, performing all the normal activities of academic life. But I couldn't stop monitoring the situation. Helios provided limited updates to contractors who had worked at Station Polaris, brief emails every few days, clinical reports on the progression of the temporal anomaly. The wound continued expanding exactly as the entity had shown me, approaching the station with inexorable patience. Communication with the remaining crew became erratic after the 3rd week, messages arriving with strange temporal distortions. Emails sent hours after their timestamps said they'd been sent, or arriving before they'd been written, content referring to events that hadn't occurred yet. The last coherent message came from Dr. Park, 5 days before the wound was calculated to reach the station. It was characteristically brief. Temporal coherence approaching 0. Observable superposition of multiple time frames. Station exists in at least 7 distinct configurations simultaneously. Crew experiencing all possible versions of recent events as equally real. Communication may not be possible after displacement reaches critical threshold. Data transmissions will continue automatically as long as equipment functions. Project Memoria objectives achieved. Observations unprecedented. No regrets. After that, nothing, or rather, nothing comprehensible. The automated data transmissions continued, but the information they contained became progressively less interpretable. Measurements and observations that contradicted themselves, timestamps that formed impossible sequences, readings that suggested equipment was functioning in multiple different states simultaneously. Helios sent a reconnaissance team to the station's location 3 weeks after contact was lost. They reported that the buildings were still physically present but had become temporally unstable, appearing to shift between different configurations and time periods. Sometimes the station looked newly constructed, the paint fresh and systems pristine. Other times it appeared ancient, weathered by centuries or millennia of exposure. And sometimes it wasn't there at all, just empty ice where the buildings should have stood. The team documented everything from a safe distance, but made no attempt to enter the structures or retrieve any personnel. By then, Helios had officially designated Station Polaris as a total loss, with all crew members declared legally dead, despite the absence of bodies or definitive evidence of death. Families were notified, insurance claims were processed, and the facility was effectively abandoned to the expanding temporal wound. That was 18 months ago. I'm still in Seattle, still teaching and conducting research, trying to rebuild my career and forget about the impossible things I witnessed in the Arctic. But the experience has changed me in ways I'm still processing. I find myself obsessing over time, checking clocks compulsively, noting inconsistencies between my watch and my phone, feeling uneasy when minutes seem to pass too quickly or too slowly. I've become hyper-aware of causality, of the way events flow from past to future, and I find myself disturbed by anything that seems to violate that progression. And I dream about Station Polaris. Not nightmares exactly. The dreams aren't frightening so much as disorienting. I'm back in the station, walking through corridors that stretch into impossible distances, working in Lab 3 while the walls cycle through transparency and opacity, showing me ice and darkness and other versions of the facility existing in different times. I see my colleagues, the 13 who stayed, and they're alive and working but also transformed, existing in states that aren't quite human anymore, adapted to life inside the temporal wound. Sometimes in these dreams they're trying to tell me something. Messages passed across the boundary between their existence and mine, information about what they've learned, what they've become, what the wound really is. But I can never quite understand, and I wake with the sense that I've forgotten something critical. That crucial knowledge has slipped away in the transition from sleep to waking. The temporal wound continues expanding. Helios monitors it from a distance, using satellite imagery and long-range instruments to track its growth. The current models predict it will reach Utqiagvik in approximately 8 months. Beyond that, the projections become uncertain, but the pattern suggests the wound will continue spreading, consuming more of the Arctic, creating an ever larger zone where time has no consistent meaning. There's talk of evacuation, of relocating the entire community before the wound arrives. But where do you go when time itself is the threat? How do you outrun something that exists in all moments simultaneously? And what happens to the world if the expansion doesn't stop? If the wound continues growing until it encompasses not just the Arctic but temperate zones, population centers, entire continents? I don't have answers. No one does. We're witnessing something unprecedented, a breakdown in the fundamental structure of reality that we don't know how to prevent or reverse. All we can do is observe, document, and try to understand before the boundary between now and forever dissolves completely. The ice cores I analyzed sit in storage at Helios's secure facility in Alaska, preserved at the temperature required to maintain their integrity. The data I collected remains in corporate servers, available to authorized researchers who might find patterns or meanings I missed. And somewhere in the Arctic, Station Polaris exists in all its possible states at once, past, present, and future collapsed into a single eternal moment, where 13 researchers continue their work in dimensions we can't properly perceive. I haven't been back, haven't tried to contact Helios about future Arctic work, haven't pursued any research that might take me north again. But sometimes, late at night when the silence in my apartment becomes too profound, I hear it. That voice I encountered in Lab 3, speaking words I can't quite understand in a language that bypasses comprehension. And I know that somewhere in that frozen waste, something is waiting, patient in its wrongness, as the boundary between what is and what might be continues to erode. The temporal wound is still growing, and I know that eventually it will reach us all.